Hi everyone, my name is Cheyenne and welcome to my channel. If you're new here, I do videos on communication studies, and this video is actually the start of my theories playlist. Don't have a name for the playlist yet, but essentially I'm just gonna make a series of videos on all of the theories you need to know for a communications degree. And we're gonna start off today with semiotics. Semiotics is the study of signs. Signs are really anything. Like when you think about it, a letter is a sign for a sound. And when you bring letters together, they bring sounds together, and those sounds create words. And those words are signs of like concepts that we have in our head for things. And those concepts, when we want to communicate them to other people, we have to put those words together in a structured sentence so that we can communicate meaningfully to the other person. So signs are a really big part of language, and language is a really big part of meaning and representation. All of them work together in like a really detailed kind of way that I'm gonna try to explain in this video. But the process of language and meaning and representation can be bigger than just like speaking languages. You can really think about anything as a language. So for instance, fashion can be a language. Obviously wearing certain clothes means something. Wearing a skirt versus pants means something. Even like the brands that you wear, they have meaning. How you wear your clothes, people can make judgments about you, create meanings in their heads of you, and group you with other people just from the clothes that you wear. So language doesn't always just mean linguistics. It can really mean anything, like a system of representation, basically. So representation means using language to say something meaningful or to represent something about this world to other people. And all of that starts with signs. Signs are like the foundation of representation, and semiotics is the study of signs. So let's talk about signs. When it comes to semiotics, like the founder would definitely have to be Ferdinand de Saussure, because his work is used most often. But there also is the work of Charles Sanders Peirce, who contributed like a very important part to how we use semiotics today. Ferdinand de Saussure, he was born in Switzerland, moved to Paris, and did most of his work in Paris. And he was a linguist, so he was studying languages. And what he did was broke up the sign into two parts, the signifier and the signified. So the signifier is like the actual object in the world, or like the symbol that we are talking about. And then the signified is like the concept of the signifier, or the object that we have in our heads. The relationship between the signifier and the signified is arbitrary, and this is a very important point for Saussure. So for example, say we are using the sign of a tree. So we'll have the word tree, and that is the signifier, because this word is supposed to mean the concept that we have in our heads of a tree. But when we say that signs are arbitrary, it's because the letters of the word tree don't actually look like a tree, or like the sound tree doesn't look like a tree. Like there's nothing about the signifiers that we use to represent trees that would actually tell you that it's a tree, other than the fact that you were told when you were a kid, this word is tree and a tree is this. So basically signs are fixed. Their meanings are fixed by codes that we as humans have when we build languages. We build like these secret codes, and we're like, hey, this word tree means tree. It's never gonna change, so just remember it and play along. So another important aspect of Saussure's understanding of signs, or his version of semiotics, is that all signs are a part of a system. And it's not that the code and like the relationship between the signifier and the signified is what produces meaning. What actually produces meaning is the fact that signs are classified into other like groups. And it's a difference between the groups that make the signs signify, that make them actually produce meaning. So if I go back to my example of a tree, we don't know that a tree is a tree because of the word and the letters that make up the word tree. We know that a tree is a tree because it's not a bush and it's not grass. So we've classified tree in like this system of plants, and trees are different than grass and they're different than bushes, but they're all plants. So if I put a picture of a tree next to a picture of the color red, like how am I supposed to know what these are? Like if you didn't know what they were, how would you figure out what they were? Like putting a color next to a plant doesn't produce meaning. Like if you put red next to green, then it makes sense because red is red because it's not green, or it's not blue, or it's not yellow. If I put a tree next to a bush, then I know what a tree is because it's not a bush and it's not grass and it's not a flower. So really it's the differences between signs that produces meaning. It's not really like the word that produces the meaning or the object that produces the meaning. It's how the object relates to other objects that are similar to it. So Saussure put a lot of emphasis on binaries, on the fact that meaning is developed between differences of signs. So if there was light, then there'd be darkness. The way you understand light is by understanding darkness. But obviously, like, there's a lot of nuances that he didn't capture in his studies, because like in between light and dark, there's like gray, a lot of gray. And so like, how would you account for that if it's just a binary? For Saussure, semiology was a structure. It was about a signifier and a signified coming together to make a sign. Another major breakthrough in his study of semiology was that he took away our notion of meaning and language as something that comes from the speaker. Before the study of signs, it was really just like language just comes from within and it comes out, and that's how we understand anything in this world. But really what Saussure taught us and what he demonstrated in his work is that you can't speak meaningfully to other people if you don't follow the rules of a language. And so if you're following those rules, then language is obviously a social phenomenon. So he broke up the language system into two parts. There was la langue, which is like the actual rules and grammatical like rules that you need to speak a language meaningfully. Like if you don't use these rules when you're forming your sentences, then you're not going to make sense to other people. And that's the social aspect of a language. And then there was also la parole, which was like the surface language, whether we're writing words, speaking words, drawing things, like that's the parole. And that is like what we use to communicate. It's the speech act that exists outside of ourselves. Whenever we want to communicate, we have to use the speech act, the parole, whether it's words, symbols, like drawing, sounds. We have to use that to communicate. But if we don't communicate it in the language system or la langue that makes sense, then our meaning will be lost. So what that really means is that language is not from within, meaning is not from within, it's a social phenomenon, it's worked through with people, and we all have to agree on the same things or we'll never understand each other. Okay, so before we move on to Pierce, let's just talk about meaning for a second, because I'm saying all these things about how language produces meaning and like how somehow that relates to representation, but like how does it all really work, right? So think about it this way. How would two people know that the word tree means this like really large plant that grows in nature? The meaning, like knowing that tree means tree, the meaning is constructed by a system of representation. So what that means is that we have our conceptual systems of what things are in our head, what they mean, and then we have our language system with like the words that represent the concepts in our head. And those systems working together create a system of representation. And like the act, the practice of matching the concept to the word, that practice creates meaning. So I know what you mean when you say tree because we both have the same conceptual map and the same language system to communicate effectively. The only thing that's holding this together, like the only thing that sustains the practice or the act of representation, are the codes. So like a long time ago, you and I both learned that the word tree means tree. And if we hadn't learned that, then me saying tree to you would not make sense because you don't have that code. You don't know that these two are like together, they're fixed together by our code. So a really easy example of this would be a different language. Like somebody who speaks a different language learned a long time ago that there was a different word that means tree. And they didn't learn that the word tree meant tree. And so if you said tree to them and they're speaking completely different language, they might not know what you mean. And if you didn't have an actual tree in front of you to be like, look, tree, then meaning would be lost. There would be no meaningful communication of ideas between the two of you because you don't have the same codes that fix your signifier with your signified. So this might all seem very obvious and like nauseating having to go through details like this for no reason because it's obvious, but there is like a bigger picture to all of this that like if you don't have these small parts, the bigger picture wouldn't make sense. So basically, the bigger picture is that meaning does not exist within a thing. Meaning is constructed outside of that thing and between people and at large in culture, in society. So now moving on to Charles Sanders Peirce. So he was an American and he conducted his own research on the study of signs. He actually called it semiosis, not semiology. And he took a more philosophical, logical approach to the study of signs, not a linguistic approach, the way that Saussure did. So I didn't really learn about Peirce when I was in school doing communications degree. So I kind of have to like read about it myself to like make this video, but I found a really good article on Medium that explains his theory. So I'm gonna put a link to that in my description if you're interested in reading that. But I'm gonna go ahead and explain it now. For Peirce, semiosis, or the study of signs, was a process. Whereas for Saussure, it was a structure. You had a signifier, you had a signified, they made a sign, and those signs conveyed meaning because they were different than other signs. And he really focused on that binary aspect. So for him, it was very structured in understanding how meaning is developed. But for Peirce, it was a process. And the reason it was a process was because he had a three-part understanding of what makes up a sign. So for Peirce, a sign was made up of the interpretant, the representamen, and the object. So what's unique to Peirce is that he really had an emphasis on the act of interpretation. It wasn't just like Saussure where like there was a specific meaning, a singular concept that was linked to a singular signifier. For Peirce, he really allowed room for interpretation for the person who's receiving the sign or reading the sign to have their own idea of what the sign means. So in his three-point model, the interpretant is like basically the signified in the mind of the interpreter. So like what the interpreter or what the person who's viewing the sign, what they think of when they see that sign. The representamen was the form that the sign took. So it didn't necessarily have to be a material, concrete object. It was just what that signifier is. And the object is like the referent, like what is the signifier, the representamen referring to? That actual thing is the object in his three-point system of the sign. So let me give you an example. So imagine you have a stop sign. The stop sign is the representamen, the actual octagonal shape with the red coloring and the stop sign, like the stop letters in the middle in white. That stop sign is the representamen, the form that the signifier takes. So when we see a stop sign, right, the idea that we get in our heads, the signified in our heads is like the idea of stopping. Like you see a stop sign, you're like, oh, I need to stop moving. That is the interpretant, what we think of when we see the representamen, the stop sign. We think I need to stop moving. The object is us actually not moving anymore. So if I'm driving, I see a stop sign and I come to stop, that is the object. That is what was supposed to happen, the action that was supposed to be taken from seeing a stop sign. If that seems very obvious, let me use a different example. Imagine you're a stunt driver and you see a stop sign and you actually don't want to stop. So even though in your head, you see the representamen, the stop sign, the signifier, you get the concept or you get the signified of stopping, but you don't actually stop. You just blow through the stop sign. Does that mean that you don't know what a stop sign means? No. It just means that your interpretation of a stop sign, your signified of a stop sign means that like it's relevant to your situation. It doesn't actually mean that you need to stop. Like when it's 3 o'clock in the morning and you're driving, do you stop at a stop sign or do you just keep going? Philosophical questions. This is Peirce's perspective on the study of signs. So when we're looking at Saussure's model of the study of signs of semiotics, it's very obvious that the letters that make up words don't always look like the concepts that we have in our heads of them, but we didn't really like stress too much because it was just a language. Like that's just how languages work. But for Peirce, who was looking at things very broadly, not just in the concept of language, but like in life, he felt like it was important to distinguish between the different types of signs because the signifier, the stop sign, doesn't look anything like the action that one takes when you stop. Like there's no relation at all. Like if I showed you a picture of a tree, then like you might understand what I mean because it kind of looks like the concept that we have in our head, right? But the stop sign doesn't look like stopping at all. So he felt like it was important to distinguish between different types of signs because sometimes they do look like their object and sometimes they don't. Peirce came up with 3 types of signs. One is the iconic sign. So you can think of this as like icons. When you go to the bathroom, there's like the boy icon, the girl icon, so you know which bathroom to go in, and like very minimalistically, they do sort of resemble male and female humans. So the next type of sign would be indexical. So indexical basically means like, it doesn't look like the concept that's coming to your mind, but it kind of like, you know, cause and effect. Like that signifier would mean this. So for example, if you see smoke, that means fire. If you see smoke, it doesn't mean that there's cake, right? Like smoke means fire. It's a sign to signify that there is fire. Another thing would be like skulls, like, you know, that symbol with like the skulls and the bones like this, like that means danger. That means like if you do something that has this sign on it, something bad will happen to you. And bad is represented by death, skulls, bones. So the third type of sign that you have is a symbolic sign, and that is basically when the only thing that makes the sign signify the concept that we have in our head is the code that's holding them together, the agreement in the society or in a culture that this means that. So that's basically all languages, like the symbol that we use to represent the concept, the word that we use, that is a symbolic sign of the concept in our head. Even in the example that Pierce has with the stop sign doesn't look like actually stopping, and so the stop sign is a symbolic sign of the act of stopping. So let's recap what we've learned so far about semiology. Basically, the study of signs, semiology, is kind of like a hodgepodge of different theorists, mostly Ferdinand de Saussure and Charles Sanders Peirce. Just to recap, semiotics is the sign broken up into two parts, the signifier and the signified. And the signified is the concept that we have in our heads. The signifier is the word or sound or image that we use to represent that concept. When we talk about how do we produce meaning, it's about that relationship, that space between the signifier and the signified, the code that we've all agreed upon that fixes the image or the word to the concept. And so when we're able to communicate, we know what we're talking about because we both have the same codes. That is a system of representation, using our system of concepts and our system of language to create meaning or to represent the world meaningfully to other people. That is the practice and the act of representation. But what's really important is that the connection, the codes that link the signifier and the signified are arbitrary. There's nothing in nature or in this world that actually holds it together, other than the fact that we've all agreed that this is going to hold it together. And so something that Peirce brought to the study of signs is that you really have to think about the system of concepts that the interpreter has when they're reading a sign. If they don't share that same system, or if they don't have the same like connections of concepts in their mind, they're not going to interpret the sign the way that you might have thought somebody would. And this has real ramifications when we talk about cultural studies, because different cultures have different maps of their concepts or different systems of concepts that are specific to them. So for instance, if you think about like Inuit cultures that live in like very remote, cold areas, they have a lot of words to describe snow that people in like the city or people that don't ever experience snow would not have, right? Because they see snow in so many different ways than like someone who doesn't see snow at all. Or even if you think about like French culture, they have a lot of words for cheese, whereas like people in cultures that don't eat that much cheese would just think that cheese is cheese. So when we talk about representation and we talk about cultures having different like sets of signifieds, different types of concepts, different systems and ways of organizing concepts, that's when you can start using semiotics to sort of talk about media studies, talk about how different races, different genders, different classes are represented in the media based on a culture. The fact that codes are arbitrary, the fact that the only thing holding things together is just an agreement between people, means that meaning can change. And if meaning can change, that means that each time period has their own truth or their own meaning that's specific to them, and over time that can change. So sure, maybe the word tree hasn't really changed over a long period of time, but things that have changed would be like race. Gender has changed a lot, even like in the last 20 years. One's like sexual orientation, the meaning of that has changed over time. And that's why semiotics is so important to media studies, to cultural studies, because everything that we communicate between each other is constructed. It's not set in nature. It's not given to us by God or by what's around us. It's us communicating between ourselves, and we can always use that for good or for bad. and that's what cultural studies is trying to understand. So that brings me to the end of my video on semiotics. Thank you so much for making it this far. It was pretty much one of like the more denser videos I've probably made on this channel, but I hope that I explained it well. Let me know in the comment sections if you have any questions about semiotics. I'd be happy to answer them. I am gonna keep going with this. I'm gonna start talking about representation theory, Stuart Hall, how that relates to media studies, hegemony, ideology, all of that stuff. So if you're interested in that content, make sure you don't forget to subscribe, like this video so I know to make more about it, and thank you for watching.